Landmarks of the old Oregon country, visiting historic places in the Northwest.
Hi, I'm Jane Ferguson.
And I'm Mark Sparks.
And we're standing outside the front gate of Fort Clatsop National Memorial, about 6 miles south of Astoria, Oregon. Although no trace of the original fort has ever been found, historians believe this replica stands on or close to the actual site. It was built in 1955 and based on a sketch by Captain William Clark.
And to help us with our story, we're going to have the aid of some of the fort's special interpreters.
Interpreters?
That's right. Men and women who dress in clothing similar to that worn by the explorers are a special feature here at Fort Clatsop National Memorial. They can demonstrate many of the skills needed by Lewis and Clark to survive that long winter of over 180 years ago.
Sounds exciting.
At daylight this morning, we were awoke by the discharge of firearm of all our party, and a salute, shouts, and a song which the whole party joined in. That was how Captain William Clark, writing in his journal, described Christmas morning at Fort Clatsop in 1805. Clark and his company had a lot to be grateful for. Together with his partner, Meriwether Lewis, and the 31 other members of their Corps of Discovery, they had safely traveled 4,000 miles from St. Louis, Missouri, to the mouth of the Columbia River and the coastal waters of the Pacific Ocean.
And yet, in some ways, their greatest challenge lay ahead. It had been 19 months since they left family and friends behind. President Thomas Jefferson sent them to the Pacific Ocean by way of the Columbia and Missouri rivers. He told them to map their route in careful detail and to establish friendly relations with the Indians. Along the way, they recorded in their journals information about this land, its people, animals, and plant life.
But on this Christmas day, their holiday meal did little to lift their spirits. Our dinner consisted of poor elk, so much spoiled that we ate it through mere necessity, some spoiled pounded fish, and a few roots.
On November 15th, the explorers had gotten their first glimpse of the Pacific surf near the mouth of the Columbia River. They were almost too tired to be excited, for winter was nearly upon them, and they badly needed rest, better food, and a chance to recover from their long journey. Lewis and Clark had hoped that when they reached the Oregon coast, they might find a ship from which they could obtain trading goods for their return journey and possibly send one or two explorers back by sea with a copy of the journals. But as they watched the horizon day after day, it became clear that they would have to make their return back the way they had come. And since the mountain passes would be buried under snow and ice until spring, winter quarters had to be found, and quickly.
With the weather showing no signs of improving, the company began its search for a suitable site for their winter encampment. And by the early part of December, they had decided on a location on the southern side of the Columbia by a small river called the Natal by the local Clatsop Indian tribe. Here, wood was plentiful. Deer and elk were abundant. Tall trees protected them from the fierce ocean storms, and they were close to both the coast and the Columbia River.
By this time, the Corps of Discovery numbered 33. Including Captains Lewis and Clark, 3 sergeants, 23 privates, Clark's servant York, and 2 interpreters. One of them, Toussaint Charbonneau, had brought his wife, a Shoshone Indian woman by the name of Sacagawga, and their baby son, Jean-Baptiste, who was not yet 1 year old.
On December 9th, they began to build a small fort. A sketch on the elkskin cover of Captain Clark's field book shows the fort's plan. and though the company was very tired, they worked long hours in the rain and the cold and were able to move in on Christmas Eve, 1805.
In honor of their friendly native neighbors, the Clatsop tribe, they named their winter home Fort Clatsop. As we enter through the main gate, we can see on this side of the fort the 3 rooms which house the 23 soldiers and 3 sergeants. This is the room of the Charbonneau family. The expedition's interpreter and guide, Toussaint Charbonneau, lived in here with his wife, Sacagawga, and their baby son, Jean-Baptiste, whom Captain Clark affectionately called Little Pomp, or Pompey. Pompey had traveled with his mother on this incredible journey, probably carried on her back in a cradle board very much like this one. And on a wet and wintry day that February, he celebrated his first birthday at the fort. Sacagawga is famous as the only woman in Lewis and Clark's company. She shared their hardships bravely and helped them learn to survive on what food could be found in the wilderness. And perhaps most importantly, her presence in the company helped assure native tribes that they had nothing to fear from these strange intruders.
Through here are the quarters of Lewis and Clark, where we were earlier. Here, during those long winter days, the captains oversaw all the activities of the fort, and working by candlelight at their stand-up desks, they at last had time to devote to their journals.
Their descriptions of the lives, language, and customs of the coastal Indian tribes of northern Oregon are among the best ever compiled. And while Captain Lewis collected pages and pages of descriptions and drawings of the local plants and animals, Captain Clark worked on a completed map of their route to the Pacific and planned their return trip. These are the orderlies' quarters, where York, Clark's servant, and the one black man to participate in the expedition stayed. And here's the entrance to the meat storage room, where fires for smoking the meats burned constantly.
The Corps of Discovery would spend the next 3.5 months at Fort Clatsop, living with a climate future Oregonians would come to know very well. Rainy winters. During the next 106 days, there would be only 12 days without rain and only 6 days of sunshine. And for a company already weary and struggling to hold their soaked and rotted clothing together, it was a challenge every bit as tough as any they'd encountered before. Even wearing one of these hats woven from cedar bark and bear grass by the Indians could only help a little.
Adding to their problems and causing more than just a few sleepless nights were fleas. Thousands of fleas everywhere, crawling inside their bedding and their clothing. Those pesky little bugs were just as anxious to get out of the rain as the explorers were. Makes me itchy just to think about it. Let's go warm up by the fire.
Every day we hear about eating the right foods. Well, the members of the Corps of Discovery were concerned about their diet too. But although they had quite a variety of foods at Fort Clatsop, they often had to eat the same thing for days. By the time they had settled at the fort, it was agreed that the favorite food among many of the explorers was not salmon, not venison, not elk, it was dog. In his journal, Captain Lewis wrote, "For my own part, I have become so perfectly reconciled to the dog that I think it an agreeable food and would prefer it vastly to lean venison or elk." But it should be pointed out that Captain Lewis's own dog, who made the journey with him, never found his way onto the company menu.
At Fort Clatsop, elk were to prove far more important to their survival than the occasional treat of a roast dog. That winter, their hunting parties killed a total of 131 elk and 20 deer. Roasted, dried, or boiled, elk was often the only thing they had to eat, and they ate a lot of it, about 5 to 7 pounds of meat per person every day. Imagine a well-balanced meal of an elk steak with a side of roast elk, and for dessert, elk.
Nearly as important to the explorers was the use of elk hides for making clothing and moccasins. Dressing elk and deer skins was another daily activity at the fort. And that January, Captain Lewis complained that his men didn't have enough brains to tan their hides. What he meant was that the only way they had of dressing the hides was by a process which used the brains of the animal to make the hides soft and workable.
Having to do things in the rain just made them that much harder. And what's the hardest thing you can do in the rain? Starting a fire. Park Ranger Dan DiTilio is also an interpreter here at Fort Clatsop, and he's going to demonstrate for us a fire-starting tool that was essential to all the explorers. What is it, Dan?
Mark, this is a tinderbox. Each member of the expedition would have had one, and it was used for starting fires. Carried your tinder inside, which could have been any flammable substance that was very dry. In this case, it's dry cedar bark. You also had a flint and steel that you carried along with that. You hit the flint on steel, you get sparks.
Okay, I see.
And what you try to do is you try to catch one of those sparks on a piece of burnt material. See what happens?
Uh-huh.
The next step would be to put that into your dry tinder and try to blow it into a fire.
That's already smoking. Oh, there. Thank you, Dan. That's amazing. And why else was fire so important? Not just for heat, but also light. Candles were very important to the explorers, so much so that they even brought their own candle molds with them. And when their supply of tallow candles ran out in mid-January, with Sacagawga's help, they managed to render new tallow from elk fat by boiling meat and bones in a kettle, then pouring off the fat into the molds with the wicks tied in place. When it cooled and pulled away from the molds, they simply had to untie the wicks and pull out a new supply of candles to give them light through the long, dark winter nights.
About 200 yards from the fort is this canoe landing. As close as can be determined, this is the original site where the expedition first stepped ashore in December of 1805. This is the river the Indians and explorers called the Natal. Today it is known as the Lewis and Clark River. From here, it was easy for the company to reach the Columbia River downstream and elk hunting areas upstream. After crossing the Rocky Mountains, the explorers learned from the Nez Perce Indians how to make dugout canoes with fire. From a single giant log, they would carve the outer structure, and then by setting controlled fires within the log, they could burn away the inside of a canoe, carving it and being careful not to let the fires get out of control. A finished dugout canoe would have looked something like this, built to run the rapid rivers and withstand bumping into hidden rocks.
The Clatsops and members of several other local tribes remained friendly and helpful during that winter. Many even set up camp near the fort to make visits and trading easier. These are trading beads like those brought by the explorers. The company found that the blue and white beads were favored above all others by the coastal tribes, and they used them to bargain for food, clothing, and information. Do you know where the visitor center is by any chance?
That will cost you one strand of blue beads, the large ones.
Fair enough.
After a hard winter, Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery prepared themselves for the long trip home.
And when they said goodbye to the fort in March, they were ready to go. The journey to Fort Clatsop had taken them 19 months, but it would take them a mere 6 months to make it all the way back to a hero's welcome in St. Louis, Missouri.
Fort Clatsop was a halfway point in the expedition, a trip which helped this country establish its claim to the Oregon territories and to encourage others to make the long trip to the west. The Fort Clatsop National Memorial is located about 6 miles south of Astoria, Oregon, just off Highway 101. The memorial, its visitor center, and museum are open and free to the public every day of the year except Christmas.
And living history presentations by interpreters like the ones who helped us out on this visit are featured during the summer months. Together with the Visitor Center's displays, slideshows, and films, they share with visitors the feel, smell, and taste of life as it might have been led at Fort Clatsop during Lewis and Clark's winter encampment over 180 years ago.